So my name's Dawn Howarth. I'm one of the partners of Oliver White in the European region. I've been with Oliver White for just over 10 years now, having spent 20 years in the chemical industry in a number of roles in supply chain and demand management, supply chain management, and as I often refer to for my sins, in ERPs as well. Alongside me today is my colleague Birgit, and Birgit will also just quickly introduce herself.
Thanks, Dawn. Yeah, my name is Birgit Breitschuh. I'm also partner at Oliver White, 8 years within Oliver White, 20 years. I had a proper job in fast-moving consumer goods, half of my time in supply chain, half of my time in commercial functions. And I guess in relate to this webinar, for me, measures always have been a passion. And those who know me know that my fairness button is really high, and I want to make sure we're comparing apples and apples. Key for me around measures is the empowerment, and with that comes the ownership. So holding people really accountable to do what they say they would do. So that's what I guess today's webinar is about. And Alice, if you don't mind going on to the next slide, just briefly about Oliver White for those who don't know us, and for the others a reminder. As you've seen, on our resumes, and you just heard us introducing ourselves, we are all practitioners that have been through at least one Class A business excellence journey as leaders in our business when we were in industry. We know how it's done, we know it's worth it, but we actually also know all the tricks and getting around that. And this is what the measures are about as well. Oliver White, as a person with a team back then, pioneered MRP2, then invented sales and operations planning, which then over the decades evolved into integrated business planning, and now in this decade really about enterprise business planning as well. And the core of all his activities and the team's effort is really about the integration of people, process, and tools, and understanding how things are linked, and then the processes, how they're dependent on each other at the interfaces, and then the people are a crucial part of that. And measures are the toolbox here as key drivers of behaviors as you do what you're measured on. So that's where I guess the measures link are coming on, and we're bringing in that the experience here from an Oliver White perspective on what we see in industry. Alice, do you want to move on? So just briefly on the agenda, we start with the common themes and issues we see and we experience ourselves in our time in industry, but then with our clients around measures. We then take you through, I guess, the interdependencies and how to apply the right few measures really within your business. Make sure that they're designed right and they're fit for purpose, and then really looking at the drivers or how to drive behavior and the right culture, which is important to implement that. And then really want to take you through how to get started, and this is why we're taking polls throughout the webinar as well. So with that poll function, as Dawn mentioned here, we want to see where you're standing, but give you time to reflect as well, because then the next things we will talk during the webinar are really depending on where you are at and how you drive from there.
So I think if I think about, I'm sure Birgit will say the same, with the companies that we work with, when we first start working with companies, we often see two real issues within the companies and sometimes you get the worst of both worlds of what we're going to show you, but you either see delusion or you see paralysis. When we say delusion, it's very much that people are either not looking at the right things within their measures, or are trying to create a set of measures that they can achieve, make them look good in front of their boss or in front of their leadership teams, or do not have the correct way of viewing their business. As an example for this, I once had a very probably career-limiting conversation with a vice president that almost ended up as a screaming match, which I'm possibly not proud of. but was about why we should exclude certain situations from our customer service measures because they were difficult to achieve. And so the attitude was, let's just exclude them, let's not include them in the measures, let's pretend that all is okay, even though in reality we were failing to meet our customers' requirements, and therefore we had some pretty unhappy customers. And rather than looking at the process and how we satisfy them, it was taking the easy option of just pretending it didn't happen. So I think, there's a lot of businesses who effectively are sticking their fingers in their ears and singing la, 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 rather than trying to really dig into and understand how the measures can really drive their understanding of their capability, but also their improvement agenda. So, if you measure too few things, you only focus on one or two key elements, then you can be like a duck paddling on the water, thinking everything is okay, but having absolute chaos through the organization. If you only set the targets as to what you achieve, you're setting your aspirations way, way, way too low. You really want your measures to be a challenge to you. You want to welcome and have occasional failures, because that's where you learn. So if you look at, and I know when I'm a nosy Parker, when I go to a scoreboard or see a scoreboard in any company, I always stop in front of it and I want to see the measures. And if I see a sea of green, then I just really think they're not telling me anything. They're not really going to be driving for improvement. They're either too superficial, too narrow focus, too many exclusions, etc., and they're not really going to help the business. The other side of that we see is people measure absolutely anything that moves. They measure hundreds and hundreds of measures. And I think I have been to one client where I said, show me your measures. And they rolled out literally 90 measures for a site. But what were they doing with it? Because there was no focused, targeted improvement. There was no hierarchy to understand which were the important ones. There was no accountability in terms of nobody really knew who owned some of the measures. So I think it's about, that paralysis is, we have so many things going wrong in a business. Where do we start? How do we apply some kind of methodology to target in and narrow in on which of the things that are going to change the dial, which is going to make a significant improvement to our business. So we're really looking, and sometimes, as I say, you see all of these within clients. It is about getting control. It's about having enough measures that tell you where you're going. It's about having the right level of definition without demoralizing or depressing people because they think the performance is currently too poor. It's about driving that performance improvement as a whole organization through openness and transparency between functions, rather than just having a process that says leadership have said we will measure, we do nothing with it, or we measure in a way that we think we're going to be good. So just in terms of what you've just seen, just wanting to do a quick poll to check with the people, does that resonate with you? Do those kind of situations exist within your company? Do you recognize all of what we've just shown you, some of them, none of them? So we're just going to flash up a very quick poll on the screen. And if you could just give us your views of where you think, and we can see the tallies coming up. Oh, nobody's saying they've seen none of them so far. Now, isn't that a surprise? So this is really just get a starting point of where we're going to pick up from as we go through the line. We're going to hone in on one or two of these areas. But from what it's showing as we move towards closing in on the poll, I think, is it seems to be about a 50-50 split, between people recognize some or most of those comments. Kind of gives us, Birgit and I, quite a lot of opportunity to maybe give you some food for thought then as we move on today, and to maybe give you some pointers of where you could start to address some of these issues and how to really attack or approach the focus on the measures in your organization.
Absolutely.
So, but
it's
if
not
we move, yeah.
It's not a surprise, isn't it, on what we see? I guess that's that is pretty common, which is actually related to what we trying to show here on this slide. So we need to first, well, as Dawn said, well, set up the right ones and really put the the right understanding and behavior in place. But to do that, we need to understand the interdependencies. And I guess that starts with what we talk and measures hierarchy, really cascading that from what are the business objectives, what's the strategy, and how does that what are the priorities for the business, and how does that relate and cascade down. For me, that means that everybody in the organization needs to understand with why I'm going to work every day, what I'm doing day in, day out. This is how it contributes to the strategy that we have as a business. That is, I've been talking to people in a warehouse, putting pellets on cartons on a pallet, and they could articulate how important it is to deliver in full, on time, to quality, as this is the strategic goal of the organization, which is that level that we're looking for. And every project manager being able to articulate that how this project is crucial as it delivers against the strategic business priorities. So that's what we are looking for in understanding the interdependencies, but then through the cascade of the strategy, really understand how we're depending on each other cross-functionally and how we are contributing to that. The measures hierarchy then needs to not move on, sorry, Alice. But it take a little bit longer on that here. So from a measures hierarchy, then once we understand how I belong, I need to understand as well what is the frequency that I need to now control and see if the ownership is there, the ownership is taken. And we need to really make sure we decompress the organization and see what we're doing on a daily basis, what we're doing on a weekly basis, and on a monthly basis, with the different levels of details that we are talking to that as well. But then the interdependency and the connect, we don't review the 90 that Dawn was describing, right? The 90 measures throughout every level, but everybody has a specific ownership. And again, we need to make sure that we understand how we are dependent on each other and how we contribute there. So key is to clarify that, but then also to drive the ownership and accountability at all levels. So really make sure we understand the interfaces, so who's before me, who's after me in my chain and in my role, that drive that, and then the measures will provide the facts behind that, will put the emphasis on what needs to change, and really then you can see through the measures if the processes are effectively setting up and the performance is improving because we are driving that ownership and the belong. So Alice, now you can move on the next slide. Thanks. Sorry, but I was carried away with a couple of the points there. So I assume many of you are familiar with the Class A Business Excellence Standard, and what we call here above the line is really the integrated business planning. It's a monthly cadence where we look at the forest, not at the trees. We look at the big picture, where we're going, how we're going to get there, is given by strategy. And then the IBP is the monthly control, where we step back, look at the big picture, 36 months out, and say, did we do what we said we would? Is that future plan realistic? So is our projection really realistic because of the looking in the back mirror, because of the actual performance? Is it enough? And if not, we're taking decisions to make sure we actually will get there, and we're changing course, and it's a process owned by leadership. Below the line is then the weekly and the daily elements where we are feeding the IBP, but it's really the ongoing ownership and the execution, and where we need to make sure those are fully integrated. So IBP handing over a realistic plan to the below the line, and then making sure that we're actually we're executing to plan. So we feedback and make sure there's those are going really hand in hand. So what Alice has already popped up here from a portfolio perspective, this is really where commercial and development need to make sure on a big picture above the line level is that we have the pipeline health, we have the right projects and the right activities, they're progressing at the right speed, and they are progressing, and we take decisions as roadblocks come, as things don't go as easy as we anticipated, as things are changing in our environment, to really deliver our strategy, which in this step is mostly related to margin growth through the portfolio changes that we're doing, things we're taking out, things we're adding, and really looking at that 36 months horizon. Now, in order to do that, we need to make sure we have the individual projects that are managed, but they're also measured, and the measures show the quality of and the maturity, I guess, of the project management then. And we do what we say we would. So we look at the business case value that it's delivering, the resources, and that we are not using more that we are committing. So those are the things that are feeding and that are important. And the post-launch, so again, looking at pipeline health, we need to be realistic and can't have a bias in our business case. Always say more, deliver less would be the typical dawn that we see, don't we? So really that level of more detail needs to happen in order to enable really the big picture view looking out into future. On a daily milestone performance, really, this is now where we're taking individual actions and it's a detailed project management that we're doing, and we're really focused on the next milestone, right? We understand the overall project plan, but we now focus on do we achieve the next milestone? What are the hurdles? What are the things we need to do? And then link that back on the hierarchy further up on making sure decisions are taken if we need help. So that's the escalation path then. So it's not the same measures at all levels, but they're clearly dependent on each other, and we're driving that throughout. So on the demand and I guess the commercialization of the portfolio changes then, which is that middle that middle boxes example that we're showing here. The bias and demand plan accuracy really is about the trust in the plan, making sure we are realistic and we have the truth as we know that, which is the crucial measure to really understand where we're going to go to. Will we achieve our strategy? Are we doing the right things? And being able to correct. Below the line then is the sales plan performance. As an example where we say executionally, now we want to make sure that the key account managers, the sales rep, people are focusing in execution with a realistic plan that is handed over, but they're doing as we say and not sell anything, but really doing the sales calls that were set up, me going to the hospitals, the distributors, talking to the customers, and they're moving the things forward, and they're actually getting these achievements. So we make sure that in execution, again, we are realistic, and we feed that back. And then last but not least, on the daily base, the demand control bit, it's when the orders are coming in. This is where we need to make sure we are learning as we go, we understand, so we can correct and again feed that back into the overall process.
And then when we move on to the supply side, when we look at above the line, we're looking at our aggregate supply plan. This is really about, through our monthly supply review, we have committed resources to the business, whether that is, physical assets, whether it is the people or the materials that we're going to buy. And this is whether or not we have used the assets. So did we produce what we said we were going to produce in the time that we said we were going to produce it? So have we utilized our assets effectively and committed our assets? And then out of that as well, looking at the level of inventory across the business, as saying, you know, are we utilizing our inventory the most effectively that we possibly can, or you know, in terms of the number of turns that we're having. So this tells us that whether or not we are running an efficient supply chain, and whether we're utilizing the nodes in our supply chain as well as we can. And then as we move below the line, obviously, to make sure that those, you know, that those wheels are turning effectively, we need to look at our supplier performance. Do our suppliers deliver to us on time in full when we have asked for it? Because that's obviously going to have a big impact on our inventory picture as well as our ability to produce. And then as we move even further down the line for the daily execution, we're really looking at our schedule performance on time in full. So, you know, did we produce what we said we were going to produce on the day we said we were going to produce it? And this is not about looking at, you know, we said we were going to produce 100, we produced 100, that's good, but we produced a different 100 to what we originally planned. This is at all levels, above the line, below the line, from a supply perspective. It's very much about, did we produce exactly what we said we were going to produce? Above the line, we would talk about family levels. You know, we're talking about maybe production line level, or we're talking about product families, groups of assets. Below the line, when we talk about daily schedules, it's individual SKUs. Did we make the SKU on the day that we said we were going to make it? And that's really driving us to understanding our capability to plan, as well as understanding the physical capability of our assets. And the reason we do for that, as we move to the next slide, is very much about, in all businesses, there is a tension, as you will see on the top left, where depending on where you are in the organization and who you speak to, you know, there will be, well, everybody says we want to give good customer service. There's not many businesses out there that says, no, we will give rubbish customer service and that's absolutely fine. But what you do have is a different view about that. So in some businesses, you know, you will have, well, we've got to give good customer service, but we've got to have zero inventory. That's where the problems lie within this, is when there's an unrealistic expectation and an unrealistic tension between these three areas, or that we've got to give good customer service, but you know, we're not allowed to have many changeovers, or we've got to minimize our operating costs. Because in all of the businesses, and as we see as we'll go through this, there's a level of cost and performance depending on how you run your business today. What you're looking to do is to make incremental improvements and to make changes to that, but you have to recognize your starting point. And within your measures, you need to recognize where you are today. Now, the tension needs to be a healthy tension. If there's no tension whatsoever, then I would normally describe it as you're fat, dumb, and happy. Everybody has what they want. It comes at a huge cost to the organization, and you're not really in control of those costs. So what you're really looking to do is to understand which of these areas is the one that is your priority. And for most businesses, that is customer service. And then you look at what level of customer service you want to give your customers, and what your competitors give, what the market expects. And then you look at and say, well, okay, then my levers are the inventory and operating costs. How can I become cost effective but cash conscious of how I utilize those costs, and how I can then service my customers? So, for example, if you think about from the operating costs, etc., it's very much about the lead time it takes you to respond to your customers. It can drive you into whether you're in the make to stock area, the make to order. What is the capability of each individual function within your business, and where are you holding cost because you have inefficiencies? You know, if you have poor suppliers, so back to the measure we saw on the previous screen, your suppliers aren't delivering to you on time, what will you do? You'll buffer it, you'll keep more inventory. It's going to cost you. So their poor performance ends up costing you. The same as with manufacturing performance. If your manufacturing is not reliable, you will make stuff early. It will drive you to a make to stock strategy because you cannot guarantee you'll make it when you really need to. The same as with transport, how often do you end up having expedited transport? We've ended up air freighting because we've made something late, or we've ended up having to use premium freight, or we just have to use a more expensive route because that's the only way we can effectively get there. So it's very much about having line of sight to what is making up our lead time, what is the element that is giving us that customer service. And we should be measuring on time in full for all of these areas to understand which is the weakest link. Because if you have poor performance at any one of the underlying levels, it is going to roll up and hit you in terms of your overall customer service, or it is going to be costing you money because you will be buffering between the functions to protect yourselves for something going wrong. And that's obviously where inventory comes down, because when you start talking about buffering, you buffer with time or inventory. And within inventory, as I said, there's a level of inventory you need to run your business, and you need to understand what are the levers you can pull on that inventory. And in many cases, people don't realize that one of the reasons they have inventory is because they do not have effective people, process, and tools that are running their business. They will have systems and ERP systems that do not talk to other areas, transactional delays between that, or they'll have processes that they complete maybe once a week. And any time that you are doing something on a weekly basis, the chances are you are holding inventory to buffer that. If you only look at something once a week, a lot can change. You'll be holding inventory to protect yourself from those changes. And so really by measuring how effective your transaction timeliness is, measuring how many exception messages you get from something like an MRP tool, etc., will drive you to making process improvements that will actually turn out to help you reduce your inventory levels. The same as, if you have variation or error in your demand plan, that is causing you to hold inventory typically, or a variation in error in your supply plan. If you're not able to commit and deliver on time to the business through a manufacturing, it will be held in inventory. So all of these is understanding the levers that you have before you finally come on to the big decisions that really drive where you're holding inventory, and understanding how you can target those levers. It could be your footprint. Where are you satisfying your customers from? It could be the service level that you're offering. It's all of the underlying decisions that are often not made with inventory in mind, that inventory ends up becoming the consequence of. And so it's really important for businesses to understand that the decisions they make influence and determine how much inventory they need to run their business. And if you measure the elements that you have, such as, we want to hold some strategic stock for a particular instance, or we want to have a certain service level, unless you measure those elements and saying, are we actually utilizing that inventory, then you're adding cost in that you may not need. So one of the key points is to measure all of the strategic inventories that you have, measure the lead times that you're offering to customers, measure your service level, measure where you hold, hedging stocks, etc. Because the whole thing with inventory is, if you never use the inventory, if you never use safety stock, why on earth have you got it there? It's costing you money. So don't just think about we have a rolling measure for inventory where we say we always keep 2 weeks stock. That's never going to drive you to taking control of inventory. You really need to have a dynamic model which understands why each piece of inventory is there, and then measures, back to our topic of today, measures is all about then saying, how often do I utilize that inventory that I have? How often am I complying or out of compliance? Do I have too much or too little at a fairly detailed level to know whether I'm spending my company's money effectively? And as you can see, inventory is one of my topics and passions, and I get on my soapbox when I start talking about it. So we need to understand, who owns inventory in the business? Do we have clarity on that? And the one thing I hate is when companies say they've got an inventory manager, because typically that's not that inventory manager is somebody who reads inventory a story at night, tucks it up and makes sure it is physically cared for. It's a childminder for inventory. It's not somebody who's actually determining how much inventory you have. Inventory is determined by the strategic and tactical decisions. So the owners and decision makers in those boxes are really the ones who should be driving and accountable for inventory ownership. Do we understand and measure the drivers? Do we really know what we're doing with those drivers? And therefore, do we really know how much inventory we truly need to run our business? And then we can take control and start to improve. And so if we think about, move to the next slide in terms of how do we start with this? You've all said early on that you recognize some or most of the elements that we've got. Well, really, it's about setting ourselves up for success. You've got to go through a bit of a journey here. And it's often a bit of a rocky road because it's a very emotive subject. It's often linked to people's performance related bonuses. It's often linked to the egos of some of our leaders, and we all know how big they can be on occasions. And so we have to start with getting the leadership in the right frame of mind. And what that means is we have to get them to be open between themselves and willing to, without judgment, have a discussion and conversation about the performance of different functional areas across the business. We also need to set them up with a mindset of this could end up with the results that we currently show becoming a lot worse. I have gone to organizations and had to really seriously coach not just the leadership team at the site, but at a corporate level of saying, when a site now reports against the new Oliver White definition of customer service, the result that you have previously been thinking is around 75% is more likely to be about 25. Now, when you, and Mr. Leaders, when you see and hear that, what I need you to do is say, okay, thank you for the information. I look forward to hearing how we're going to improve. And that takes a big intake of breath by many people on both sides, because obviously we're having to trust that the leaders are going to hear the message in the right way. And for the poor people who are having to deliver that message to leaders, we're having to give them a bulletproof vest and enough Dutch courage to go up and stand in front of them and saying, these measures I've been reporting to you and saying everything's great for the last however many years, really and truly, it's not as good as we would like to think. So we need to get the leaders in the right place. Then we need to give them the right message in the right way. So we need to make sure that we are visually creating the right view of our measures. And that sounds simple. It sounds like, well, that's what I would say is a little bit of faff in terms of it's not the important bit, which is driving improvement. But it is very important because we need to show some of the key points when we're presenting measures. If your performance, using that last example, is 25% and your target is 95%, then it feels like you're standing at the bottom of Mount Everest looking up and wondering how on earth you're going to get there. Whereas if you can show things like a glide path and actions and how you're going to deliver the improvement in performance, then maybe what you do is you're setting your sights to base camp. And you can see base camp in the distance and feel you've got the first steps outlined of how you're going to get there. You also want to show a little bit of history in how you present some of the measures so that you can show the trends. And because we all know that one single data point is not necessarily giving a true picture. We could have been having really, really good performance for the last few months. We've had something that's blown up that's caused us a big problem. And it could even be something that's out of our control, like, the Suez Canal thing recently, which would have caused a number of delays to shipments. That could have happened, and all of a sudden it looks like your performance is poor. If you report single points within your measures, then you're really not giving the true picture. So it's about giving the context of the measure as well as the actual performance as well. And it's about showing, that we are really driving that improvement. So the next thing then was we also need to make sure that we're documenting the measures as the next point that comes up. We really need to make sure that we have a formal policy of how we govern measures, not just what the measures are, but how often we look at them, how we introduce a new measure, how we make sure we don't grow over time to just mushrooming the number of measures that we have, and making it sustainable. So this measures needs to be something that runs alongside typically your annual strategic review. You do your annual strategic review, you then look at what measures do I need to represent that. You look at restating the target levels that you have with your metrics. You look at maybe eliminating some of the metrics which are no longer appropriate, or you are totally in control and you do not need to report anymore. So you need to set yourselves up in the way that you've got the right frame of mind, you've got the right visibility, you have it set in policy, and then you can start measuring. But when you introduce the measures, it's important that you evolve them over time as you mature. One of the things that I see time and time again, and this is when I can often get into a heated debate with companies, is when you suggest a measure. You give them the ethos, you give them the broad principle, as in, we will measure on time in full for this activity, or we will measure the aggregate version of the supply plan, or we will measure the project plan performance. And the first thing that people get into is, how do I make it green? How do I get a tolerance, or how do I include something to make it look more favorable? So when you start talking, on time in full, well, what's the definition of on time? Does that mean I can make it early? And typically, there's often a slight tolerance you can have for early, never late. Late's never good, but early can be. But people get fixated on, well, should it be 1 day early, 5 day early, or can't I argue it's 7 days early? And really and truly, they lose the focus on what the measure is trying to drive. So start measuring black and white. Tolerances come later when you learn what the capability of your process is. So that's all about your tolerances need to be something that is justified. To justify them, you really need to have data, and you will only get data by measuring. So there needs to be this evolution of the measures, and they grow with you rather than trying to target them in right from the beginning and nail them down absolutely. And so we would often see, we start measuring roughly, we will refine, and that way the measures will be set up to constantly grow with you in the future. They're not just set in stone. And that's where you get the people on board from the behaviors point of view, is they can see that they're not being crudely measured. They can see that we're driving the process improvements, and then we can start to really see how they will evolve for us, rather than implementing a blunt instrument with no chance or little opportunity to succeed in the beginning. And we really we want to avoid that, because the other thing that we often do is we try to say we can't measure until we can put it into our tool, and we spend an awful lot of time defining the metric in the tool, and then we change the metric, and then the tool's not in line with it. So very much about measure crudely, measure manually, understand what you want, and then you can implement it within your tool.
With what you've seen, what Dawn was just presenting, setting yourself up for success, the order of the elements, you see a lot is about culture and having the right things in place. So this next pull is really for you to reflect where you're at on that maturity. Are you still in the, shoot the messenger? Do we make compromises to as Dawn said, is it are we doing everything and arguing everything to make it green so we don't have to do anything about that? Are we just reporting them up? And I've just done interviews recently where the conclusion was, well, we report the measures. And my question was, do you own them, and who owns them, and why do you have them in the first place? So are you still there, and you're happy when it's over? Or are you using them really to drive that improvement, to really understand what's the cause of that? And if they're all green, and Dawn said, well, that wouldn't tell me anything, are we then tightening the belts and making them harder so we really understand what we can do? And or are you already at the level where you say leadership is fully supportive, they understand the why, they understand the how, and they really help to drive the accountability to where it should be? Give you a little bit of time to really look at that, but this is I guess what we often see is that, you know, it's not the right measures, not set up at the right moment. And I see the voting is
Oh, there's a
going
few shooting that
on.
we're shooting a few messengers along the way. I always like it when
Yeah.
a few messengers get shot. And it's funny, the leadership has gone down and down as other people are voting. It's a very interesting view actually across there. I think a lot of people, I'm seeing the pain though. We seem to be getting about 40% of people at the moment are feeling the painful cycle. So, and I know that one myself. I can remember having to do certain inventory reporting, and I would literally buy a cream cake once a month in my office, and I would put it next to my computer, and that would be my treat, is I could only eat it once I had done all of the reporting for the month of something I really, really hated doing.
Absolutely. I think we've all been there, isn't it? So, okay, so for the majority, it's really still more painful. We're making compromises and you know, shooting the messenger. Glad to see there's a good percentage already where leadership is there. And where we at least understand and focus on improvement. So you're right, on the right track there. So that's that's useful now for the, I guess, for the next slides, which are a bit more tangible in where we're looking into. So if you move one more, yeah, great. So I guess to what Dawn described, what we need to make sure is we need to coach the leaders, and you know, we address that, and we would talk a bit more about that as well. We need to make sure we have the right measures, and we need to then mature that. But with that definition, so what we need is well, clearly understand what's the purpose. This is where it needs to start. I need to understand what I'm trying to drive here, drive the ownership. And what you see on the left hand is examples of policy documents, which one's the why do we measure, and what are we driving, the customer service, in order to reduce our lead time, in order to free up cash. You know, once we have understood that, it's then really about some of those details. As Dawn explained very nicely, it's not about the final number, but we really need to understand what are the behaviors that we're driving. And I mean, if I'm, you know, just taking an example from with lockdown, and you know, you have a home delivery, you wouldn't be happy if your food would arrive maybe today, maybe tomorrow. But we really need to make sure we understand what are the tolerances, what are the expectations, what do our customer needs, and in order to then go really into root cause and drive that improvement. And then back to the hierarchy, really, what you see on the right hand side is making sure the measures are owned at one level only, and you know, there's an individual ownership really for that. But then we have a reporting and an escalation path where we look at, I guess, the combination and the totality of some of those measures instead of repeating it all over. I guess what I see often is that at every level the same measure is looked at, and as they're green, they just, you know, everybody is just really pleased and really happy. But the key thing is what is behind that. And actually, one of my bosses in the past used to ask the question, well, do you even on a green measure, can you explain why, how you gotten there? Because it's not just, you know, just gotten there by chance, but making sure we really understand how we got there, that we can repeat that, and that we're actually learning and driving that. So definition is then up to the nitty-gritty detail on, you know, where the data coming from, who can change what, or ideally not change anything, and on a click of a button make sure we have those available, so the most effort doesn't go on getting the measure in place, but actually doing something about that, going into root cause and really understanding that. But it's the who and where is that owned. Again, think about the measures hierarchy and make sure we only own them at one level, and we have that escalation that helps us drive accountability really throughout.
So again, just thinking about from that last list in terms of, do we have the scopes? Do we have the tolerances? Do we have the right behaviors in place? Just another quick poll to think about, do you see vague definitions which people are able to manipulate, if I use a bit of a more emotive term, rather than not saying it's always deliberate, but people can take a positive bias on them. Do we have too many people telling you how to fix an issue in terms of every single meeting has an opinion and tells you what to do, and it's very difficult to get the clarity about what you're going to do to improve? Do we have your leaders fixated on just one or a few measures? We have people having their pet subjects. Or do you have no review process to keep your measures current? Or do you have no process to formally justify your tolerances? So tolerances, again, is another thing. We'll touch on it again a little bit more within that in the next couple of slides as well. So if we flash up I think this is the last poll. There's another one. I keep getting confused. So where do you see in terms of this, in terms of the definitions? We're seeing a few leaders fixated for sure as the numbers are coming in. So it is about, we've got to tighten up and have all of these in place, and we're going to take a look about, the root cause analysis and the attention that we need to pay on the next slide to some of these in terms of how we're going to drive the improvement as well. So we see leaders fixated. I think that's often the case. So that shows, from a behavioral point of view, we need to maybe expand the view of the hierarchy to some of our leaders so that they see a wider breadth and understand the impact, because focusing on one, again, like the duck on the water, and thinking about as well of the review process that we need to go to make sure we keep the measures current. I mean, another subject that we haven't really touched on here, but where you have some companies, you might also recognize this, is where you have a one size fits all. We have a measure that is applied across multiple locations, multiple businesses, etc., which also can give issues if you don't have physically the same processes. So having that review process to keep it current for all businesses is also important there. So in terms of driving the improvement journey, I talked about earlier that if you're then standing, at the bottom and looking up at Mount Everest, it can be seemingly impossible. So through the measures, what we're looking to do is to run the PDCA, the Plan, Do, Check, Act cycle, to drive the improvements. So understanding what we are going to do to improve a measure through root cause analysis, through Paretoing then what the issues and the reasons that we have within our measures, picking out the one or two key actions, having an action plan for it, allows you to then see the entitlement in terms of how much improvement you will deliver from a specific action. Once you have that in your timeline, you can create your glide path as to how and when the measure should improve. And that's then going to allow you to define success at a different level. So, as we're seeing here, we're looking for a target of 95%, and it's a schedule adherence and manufacturing schedule performance measure. When you're right at the bottom, as you could see with the blue lines, looking up was very difficult. But when you can look and see what your glide path is, as in, I'm going to do an action, I should get an improvement, you're then able to measure yourself against your glide path each month. And then you can say, I may not be at the target, but I achieved my glide path. That is a definition of success for that month. So reporting yourself against the glide path is a key element here, and therefore understanding the time phasing of your improvements and having that formality in root cause. Another element of it is you do have to target, especially in the beginning, because you could have 10, 20 different issues. If you try to drive an improvement on every single failure, you will tie yourself up in knots. So many businesses say, they'll say, we're going to root cause every failure. That's rubbish. What you're going to do is give a reason code for every failure, create the groupings of those reasons, and then create the action plans on the top ones that are hurting you, or some of the easy fixes, because in and amongst this, there can often be easy fixes and fixes where you're really shooting yourself in the foot. You know, I've had clients where they're having failures in their supplier delivery because they've put a delivery date as a Sunday on a purchase order and they're not open to receive on a Sunday. It's kind of, you know, defeats and it shows you all kinds of crazy things that because you've never looked at them, you've not pulled these out. Other things are going to be long lead time items. You know, if you have to buy equipment, if you have to hire and train people, if you have to, you know, if you're taking a snapshot for your measure 3 or 6 months, like bias being 6 months rolling average, you're not going to see instant improvements. What you're going to see maybe is small incremental improvements, or you're going to have to wait a period of time before you get the results. So it is important that you're targeting and seeing the time phasing. If it's going to be 3 months before you get a result, then send the message. Go back to that point about, you know, communicating and informing and educating the leaders that yes, our performance is rubbish and it's going to be 3 months before you see any difference. Don't shoot me for the next 3 months. You can shoot me in month 4 if you don't see it. So it's about giving that view, and it's really about driving the performance improvement through those glide paths. If you don't have it, if you don't have those glide paths, you will get a lot more emotional response. You'll also get an awful lot of pressure about when the improvements are going to come. If you can demonstrate that you're achieving glide paths and create that capability, so demonstrated capability says we will always, you know, we are delivering what we said we were going to do, then that will give you a lot of confidence and credibility with your leaders. So it's about that positive view going forward.
And there is another problem. So
I
was as confused as you were.
Yeah.
Which is it that relates probably actually to what you nicely described there, Dawn. It also is, do we really understand what are the drivers of the performance? So I guess the question here again about maturity, where are you? Do you on root cause analysis, really understanding those drivers, having a glide path? Are you in, you know, just reporting, more looking backwards, lagging and explaining why we couldn't and, you know, why things happened in a different way? Are we already predicting and we check against the realism? Do we have you know, do we have actions to improve that? Not maybe yet a glide path. Do we clearly understand the drivers to and leverage the Pareto approach that that Dawn was describing, because we're focusing on the key ones, the ones that move the needle, that have the impact right now, and that will help us to improve here, or do we have that, as Dawn described, a fully glide path, that understanding and really driving that? So if we're launching that poll, it's always a bit flexible with that amount of people on the line here. It depends on who goes fast, but there is quite some movement, and there is, I guess, reflecting on what you had listed beforehand and where some of the issues really are. It's not too many in that category of having a full guidebook, but hopefully that helps you understand, once you focus on the right measures, then really understand what are the main drivers and really develop that, so you understand, to Dawn's point, when time phase that comes, how we will get there, and what are the key drivers. And there are some quicker wins on measures, which is in my influence. You know, it's just about putting the right things in, correcting master data, whatever is behind that, but then it's also making sure we're collecting the facts, the root causes, to really drive that at the interfaces, because that often is then outside of our control. So a quarter really on the lagging here, in where we are at, focusing on improvement. Half of you, that is really great, that's the focus, and only a few really on driving that performance improvement and having a glide path. But really really great to see that that's the way to go. So if we're moving to the next slide, please, just in summing this up. So, you know, how do we get started? And actually there was there was a great comment from Constantine that, you know, it's not one size fits all. It's on how to drive leadership, how to get the right behaviors. It always depends, and this is you know, a lot of the conversations Dawn, myself, and our colleagues have, is really to get the leaders on board. I guess the key thing on leadership is educating them, getting that understanding on why we measure. It often is related to the company culture, so it's also having the guts to stand up and hold against and protect the team, to say, well, you know, I trust in the measure and this is the right thing. Leaders need to understand what's in it for them, and they need to be helped to understand cause and effect. And to Dawn's point, don't shoot me now, right? Shoot me at 3 months, because that is the time on when the change can only be impacted. Really, really have that. But leadership is crucial, and I'm just thinking of the bias which we have. We are seeing throughout all steps of the process at all levels within the organization, and that is just directly a consequence of leadership. It's, you know, often what we see is that's not good enough, which is a top-down and you know, driving a bias within the system, or, you know, worst I heard is your successor will, right? So it's those things we need to address. They need to be spoken and they need to be tackled. If you need to start with the measures, start with on time and full, and that is about understanding in the process who's before you, who's behind you, who's your supplier, who's your customer, and hold people accountable to do what they say they would. It's their plan that they need to be measured against. Put the measures policy in place, and make sure we have we're not putting measures on top, but from the 90 that Dawn described, we take off those, and we focus on a handful of measures that really help us understand what is driving our business, and what do we need to tackle. And then we'll have an education plan where I've seen nice things up to at shop floor, a paper at the entrance of the dressing room to make sure this is understanding on how you can help us drive performance improvement. And then plan to check, act in everything we do, so we actually don't get lucky with the results and have that green measure that we're showing, but really driving through a process the understanding, and we learn as we go. So the results are a conscious result of how we manage the process, the behaviors we have in place, and how we've set ourselves up.
I'm conscious, Birgit, that we have talked far too much and more than we ever intend, which is always a difficulty when you and I get together. We've answered a couple of questions as we've gone along from people. If people do have other questions that they would like to ask, please feel free to type them into the chat bar or the question bar, and we will get back to you. Otherwise, if you would like to submit questions, or if you have contact with us in any other way, please get in touch. You know, we're available on LinkedIn. The poll is the polls were very informative for us, and we'll be using some of those information as well. So that's really great from our point of view. Apart from that, I think it's to say thank you to everybody this morning. It is available to, it will be available to download on request if you want to listen to it again, or if you want to share it with any of your colleagues. So thank you very much from Birgit and I.